Started here. This is the magical configuration management unicorn. Hopefully you know where you're at, MidCamp 2017. Reminder if you don't. So I'm Dobrzynski. There's my Twitter handle, super easy to remember and find. My username on Drupal is dobrzyns. I'm Polish, you might know, so you can actually say dobrzyns if you want to be all fancy. I work at PMMI Media Group. I'll get into a little about what that is here. So it's a B2B in the publishing industry or packaging industry. They have several brands that they have magazines, corresponding websites. They got bought probably a couple of years ago now, before I started there, by another company, PMMI, that does a lot of shows, expositions all around packaging. So they have show sites, which I'll be referring to and talking about in this talk. So they have 6 show sites that are all different sites. They use the same theme, a lot of the same configuration, same functionality, but are completely separate sites with different content. So that's where a lot of my learning came from. Obviously, I like Drupal. I'm here talking about Drupal. I'm guessing a lot of you like Drupal too, since you're here. And I'm interested in DevOps and doing development QA, having a process, being consistent, all that good fun stuff. I also like beer. I'm a bit unusual though, and I don't like hoppy beers, so tip to get in is get me a good Belgian. So we'll go a bit about what we're going to talk about today. We'll start out with why configuration management, why it's important, why you should use it, what it means. We'll go into then D8 versus D7, which some has framed as config management versus features. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of that. Talk about content versus configuration, thinking about how to define what is content, what is configuration. We'll talk then about differences between environments that you might have, how to handle those, how those come into play with configuration management. Then we'll talk about some tools to create the magical configuration management unicorn. There are a ton out there. We won't go into all of them, but I'll talk about the ones that I have used and come up with a fairly good process by trial and error and hard learning. And then we'll talk about automating configuration import. So, why configuration management? Pointing and clicking is bad, coding and scripting is good. Generally, you're probably not going to want to work on your production site. It's generally a bad idea. You can take it down if you have a ton of content and you have used preview on. Not that that's happened to me. So you don't want to be creating views on your production server. Bring that down. You're going to want to do that on a separate environment. We all work locally. How many of you here actually work locally? Okay, so quite a few. So I guess to get a little more idea, how many of you are developers? Okay, and how many of you are non-developers? Okay.
I'm still
both
figuring out
learning?
one way to know.
Okay.
Undecided.
Okay. So at any point, if you have any questions, I go too fast, something's a little unclear, don't be afraid to stop me, question. So instead of pointing, clicking, editing that view on production, we're going to want to get it into code. So then you've created it locally. You have this great view showing all the different unicorns on your site. You don't then want to go on to production and have to point and click to recreate it. If you have an intermediary staging environment, you don't want to have to then recreate that view on staging and then on production. You want it into code so you can very easily transfer it between environments and that you don't miss something there. So, is D8 a magical land of unicorns all fancy? Castle in the background, mountains, blue sky, bright grass green. That's the idea, right? Not quite. We're a lot closer than D7. It's a lot better. So we have a unicorn. It's getting there. It's not colored yet. It's jumping, trying to get into that magical land, but not there yet. So now we'll talk a little bit about D8 versus D7, which, if you're familiar, how many have worked with features before?
A little.
Okay, so you have an idea of that. So it's often framed as you have configuration management versus features, but that's not really the case. It's more configuration management plus features optionally. They're kind of different now. Features actually uses core configuration management config objects, which is super nice now, but it serves a little bit different purpose. So let's back up a little, and this will go into a bit more depth with features in D8 versus D7. So the idea of configuration management is moving from dev to prod. It's not meant for packaging up features, related functionality. That was actually the original intent of the features module based on its name. However, people needed a way to get configuration into code and deployed across multiple environments, and they adopted features. So now features is actually going back to what it was originally intended for. And so the idea is you would use config management for configuration and then pieces of functionality. Say we have a unicorn content type, we have a view showing all our magical unicorns. We want to share that across sites. We can package it up into a feature and move that between different sites, whereas configuration management is meant for one single site moving between environments. Some also have made the argument that features is better for collaboration. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Hopefully you're using Git, which can kind of solve that. Generally, you're probably, if you're working in a multi-team environment, hopefully not going to be working on the same pieces of the site without talking to each other. So I think that's less of an issue, but it has been something some others have mentioned that configuration management isn't great for. So let's get a little into some theory here about content versus config. What is each? So content, actually defined by Drupal, their documentation is really good now. They've made a huge push in D8 to make this a lot better. So this information is actually pulled directly from Drupal.org, where they define content as information meant to be displayed on your site and edited by users. So here are some examples. You have articles, basic pages, image, files. These are all things that your users are going to be creating, uploading to your site. You're probably, as a developer, not going to be creating these. Then we get into what exactly is configuration. Configuration is information about your site that is not content and changes infrequently, in theory. Obviously there are exceptions. You get into the real world, find out, okay, things are actually moving a lot faster. Some sites may have more changes than others. So if we think about content, what might be some examples of configuration you can think of? Go ahead, shout them out. Site name.
Content types.
Content types. I think I heard one. What's that?
Oh, I just said fields.
Fields, yeah, part of the content types.
Yes.
Shared. Pardon?
API keys.
Yes, so site name, your site theme, which theme you're using, what admin theme you're using, content types as were mentioned, and views. These are all going to be examples of configuration, things that you're going to want to ideally get into code so that you're not pointing and clicking, and that you can easily share amongst developers and move between environments. But it's not quite so simple. There's a lot of gray area in between, and it actually worked out. No one jumped ahead here. At the last time I gave this at a meetup, some people kind of jumped ahead. So you didn't, so that's good. What are some things that you might think of that could go content, could go configuration?
Paragraph setups.
Paragraph setups.
Blocks.
Blocks.
Menu items.
Menu items.
Forms.
Forms. So, taxonomy terms, blocks, block layout. You have panels pages, and then separately their variants. Are these configuration? Are these content? It will vary from site. Some places you may want to treat this as configuration. Other places you may want to treat this as content. I'll actually be talking a lot about panels pages. On the sites we used, we gave them a ton of different block types that they could go in and then create their panels pages. And obviously, in that case, we're treating it as content. However, in some cases, we might want to say this page should be the same. We're going to treat this page as configuration, get it into code, so that we ensure that it always looks this way. So it can get messy because you have the same types, same features, panel pages that might be content, might be configuration, and they might be both on the same site. So some things to think about when getting into the gray area, and again, I actually pulled this from Drupal.org. Their documentation is great. Is thinking out, is this going to be done by a site builder versus a site editor? If it's something a site builder is doing, it's most likely going to be configuration. If it's something your editors are doing, it is most likely going to be content. The other thing to think about is numbers. How many are there going to be? So if we think about maybe menu items, there might be a ton of menu items. You might have a lot of taxonomy terms. An obvious example, if we use content types, you may have a lot of different nodes. However, if you're building block types, you're probably not going to have a ton of block types. You're probably not going to have a ton of views. Obviously, there are exceptions. The other final thing that Drupal.org says to think about when determining what's content versus what's configuration is to think in the idea of types of things and things. So we might have a vocabulary called unicorn colors, and we would have, that would be your type of thing, and then you have your things in it, purple, pink, blue. And so then the terms in it, the things, purple, pink, blue, would be content. The type of thing, that vocabulary, would be configuration. Any questions on that before I move into environmental differences? Okay. So the other thing you're going to want to think about is your environment differences. Your caching settings. We all know how fun Drupal caching is to work for, and it's always perfect, never have to deal with problems. When you're working locally, you're not going to want caching on. You're not going to want to be constantly clearing your cache just to see your changes. However, on your production site, you're going to want to be using caching. You don't want that page reloading or regenerating every single time someone visits it. Another thing is the develop module, or development tools in general. You're not going to want those enabled on production, but they're really helpful when you're doing development. Logging. If you're working locally, it's probably going to be easier just to use database logging, have it in the database to where you can go through the UI, see it right there. But on production, you probably don't want to use database logging just because it can become very huge, very large, very quickly. So you would then, in that case, use syslog, write it to a file, and then you can use different tools to view that and make it easier to go through. Another thing that you'll want that's really helpful during development is stage file proxy. This either hot links to the images or copies the images down, so you don't have to worry about doing that. Makes it a lot easier to see the actual site, work with, especially if you're a front-end person doing theming. You're probably going to want the images. Those will probably help you. So there are lots of tools out there. They're still being worked on. It's Drupal, the community is working on these. There are other tools out there. These are the 3 tools that I use and I'm going to talk about in this talk. So you have Configuration Update Manager, Config Split, and Configuration Installer. So we'll go a bit into what each module is. We won't get into too much depth, give more of an overview, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I use some of these and how these are helpful and help us get closer to that magical configuration management unicorn. So the Configuration Update Manager is a reporting module, or it provides a reporting module. It has a UI, or you can use it with Drush. Really helpful for importing configuration, deleting configuration, reverting configuration on a case-by-case basis. As they're doing development, you can do that singularity. Have one basic config item that you want to revert, but you don't want to revert all your configuration. Configuration Split is probably my favorite configuration module, and it might be my favorite D8 module right now. So what it does is, as its title suggests, it allows us to split configuration out. Drupal 8 by default, it's all or nothing, and it makes some assumptions about what is configuration. So with Configuration Split, you can actually define sets of configuration, and then you can define active sets in your settings.php file. So talk a little bit more about Config Split just because I like it and it's really helpful in getting us closer to ideal world magical land. So this is actually the directory structure of what you might have. I actually pulled this from a site I work on. I left out actually the one most important one, the default sync directory where configuration is exported to by default. So that would be your all or nothing configuration that should apply in all instances on every environment would go into that sync directory. But like we mentioned earlier, if there are environment differences, you may want configuration that's set up just on your dev environment. So something like database logging. You may have something you want set up on just your test environment. This last one, panels pages, this was a use case I talked about where some panels pages we wanted to treat as configuration to ensure that they always looked exactly the same way, that people didn't go in and change that. And so in that case, we do want to export it to configuration. So I created a split called panels pages. The configuration for those specific panels pages I select, and they go into that directory. So this is an example of what all I have in my dev configuration split. These are the actual file names. Every single item goes into its own YAML file. So as you can see, I have devel, I have dblog, devel toolbar, field UI. I turn off those UI modules on production so that people aren't going in, changing the content types, deleting fields, and then wondering what happened. And stage file proxy, as I mentioned, devel, we use, and then performance settings are different locally. One caveat here to mention is you can override in the settings.php file. So if you're using a local settings file, settings.local.php, you can set it in there. However, in that case, if you have multiple developers, every developer would have to go in, do that themselves, or you would have to commit that file into Git, and then they would have to remember to copy it over. So this does it automatically. If there are changes, you can push them out. All the developers have it right there. So if the URL for your staging site changes, you can update the configuration, commit it in Git, push it, and all the developers pull it. They actually don't even have to know what the change was. They can just get it. So in my test, I have dblog and stage file proxy. And then in my panels pages, this is just one example of a page that we didn't want to change, that we wanted in configuration, is our contact us page. You'll notice here there's actually a configuration file for the whole panels page itself, and then there's a configuration file for every single variant. So if you've worked with configuration management already, you might have noticed that there can get to be a lot of different files. The other thing I use that I found really helpful is configuration installer. We find as developers often the tools that come out don't meet our exact use cases, or there's a need and there's not a tool that's designed for it. We can adopt things, use it, come up with new tools. So configuration installer actually allows you to install a site from configuration. So by default, configuration isn't supposed to be shared across sites. However, in my case, we were creating show sites that had the same base, and we wanted to be able to get that set up. Initially, I didn't want to have to go in and do a lot of reverting, create a site install from scratch, and then get all that. Since there are 6 sites, this actually allows me to use the exact same configuration that I use in day-to-day development. So almost no extra work on my part. It actually takes over the Drupal installer. It actually is a profile, an install profile, so it's a little interesting in that way. But you can then go ahead, and if you use a tool, the UI, you have a selection what you install profile you want to use. If it detects that you have existing configuration, that option will be there. So let's get a little into automating the import. As developers, if we do something over and over, we like to automate it. It saves us time, makes things more consistent. If you ever do Drupal deployments, you may find there's lots of things you have to do. You have to run updates. You may have to clear your cache in between. You may import or revert configuration. You may have features that you're importing and reverting. And it's really nice to be able to automate that. The two tools that are out there that you may be familiar with is Drush and Drupal Console. How many here use either Drush or Drupal Console? Okay, so almost everyone. So in Drush, you have Drush config-import, and in Drupal Console, you have Drupal config:import. Great tool, allows you to import all your configuration. However, if you were to do just this command, what we found out the hard way is, unlike features, core functionality actually deletes. So we were working, our site editors were creating all these beautiful panels pages. We went deployed the next day, all their panels pages were gone. Luckily, we had a backup from right before the deployment, which is why you should always take a backup. So we were able to re-import that. But in our case, we didn't want it to delete configuration that existed in the database but wasn't exported. So we wanted to keep our panels pages. So the solution to that is the partial flag. So this will import your configuration, but it won't delete configuration that's not exported. So looking at how I actually do this with config split as well as features, we talked about those different sets. I have the default sync directory where all the configuration that applies globally across all environments goes. We're going to import that with drush-cim, the alias sync, give it that partial flag, say yes, we want to do this. Then if it's a dev environment, we're going to go ahead and use dev, say import this dev configuration. We don't want to delete a configuration that's not in code, but we do want to revert that configuration we have exported. And then this gets into the now plus features, not versus features. On our show sites, we also had a global module that we shared across all the sites. So we have that pulled in, and that actually we make use of features as it was intended, bundling shared functionality together. So once we get our configuration imported, we want to import our features. So this is actually how you define your config directories in the settings.php. By default, it will put it into your files directory. Better practice is to store it outside of your Drupal root. So in this case, I store it one level above the Drupal root in the directory called config Drupal, and then I have my different sets that I have defined. So hopefully this gets us a little bit closer to the configuration management unicorn. There's still a lot of work to go. Obviously, real world work is messy. We encounter instances that haven't been accounted for yet, that we don't have solutions. The community has been really fast, actually, to come up with new tools and solutions to address challenges we run into, things that weren't done by core or that were done by design that maybe we don't want to use. The prime example being that partial flag where we don't want to delete configuration. And these tools are out there, they're constantly developing. You can get involved in helping, and hopefully we can get a lot closer to this magical unicorn, a magical land of configuration. So for that, we have a good amount of time here for questions.
Yeah, I had a question about why you split out the panels pages. Is it as opposed to just leaving it in sync? Or is it that the core doesn't export the panel pages and you need to use the split module to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could have left them in sync.
Okay.
I kept separated it out just to be able to see easier.
Oh, okay. So when you're doing like code reviews and things like that to make sure that things aren't getting messed up.
Yeah,
it's easier to focus.
and organization wise. So that was a choice. So the nice thing with configuration split is you can define how that works. Another really nice thing is if you have configuration you want to ignore, you can go ahead and select that, and instead of specifying a path where to export it to, if you just leave that blank, it will not export it at all. Go ahead.
So you're talking about directories and the sync directory, and I thought, because Drupal, the way it was set up before, we had this concept of the active directory, the sync directory, and I thought they did away with all these directories.
They did.
But you're talking about the directories. Is this because of the automated tools you're using, that they're using, that's how you're doing it? Because you're trying to do like code deployment, so the code has to exist someplace.
Mm-hmm.
And so is that where these directories come back in again, is through the automated tools that you're using?
So I'm defining these sets in configuration split and saying I want all the configuration from, say, the devel module to be exported into the dev directory.
Mm-hmm.
So these are purely by choice. And then to automate it, I define the set in settings.php,
Right, uh-huh.
and then I use Drush to import that set.
So, but this is all this stuff that you're doing is basically outside of Drupal 8 core. This idea of having your various directories. So,
Yeah, it's
Okay.
it's a contributed module.
I was just checking my
Yeah,
knowledge.
yeah.
Like, wait a minute, I thought that sync and active were gone. I thought that we did away with all that
It
stuff
did,
here.
yeah.
Now he's using the word sync again. So, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Okay.
any other questions in the back?
So, are you exporting like everything and putting it in the default directory and then splitting out certain features and putting certain configuration files and putting them into those individual folders, or are you just not exporting most of it and only picking certain?
It varies. Ideally, I would not export everything I don't want. So in our case, I use the order. I use the order that I do the import of the sets. So I import the from the sync directory first, all that configuration, and then I import the configuration from the dev directory, which will change what might have been set from sync. So if in sync I have caching turned on, it will get turned on, and then dev import configuration would then turn it off. Ideally, you would go in and set it up to not export the performance settings into the sync directory.
Yeah, I don't know what the status is, but there's a gray list, and I don't think it's a terrible term.
Yeah.
And config split about excluding certain things, but I haven't done it myself.
Yeah, there's a lot. I didn't go into that just because there's a lot of, it's unclear what it is, and the documentation isn't good.
I think the intent and the direction it's going, I guess, I think the direction it's going is to basically say, like, I don't want to export forms, YAML forms or configuration files. I don't want to export them to content. So you could set up a pattern and then it just won't export those things.
Yeah, there's actually another tool out there. I'm forgetting the name, but it allows you to do kind of config split based on patterns. Whereas configuration split, you have to explicitly select. So you can either select modules or you can select individual configuration items. For example, a single panels page variant.
Yeah, so I haven't actually used any of these tools. Any stuff that I've done with configuration, I don't have this automated process. And I can tell you that for me, I've had precisely 0 times that I've been successful if I've ever tried to use single exports and do stuff. Because I always forget something. And so what I've had to revert to is like, I have to export the entire config, get the whole tarball, and then bring the tarball in. And then it works great. Except the thing that I struggle with then is like, but if you're on a development environment and people are doing stuff in there, you might not want all of that.
Correct.
Tarball exported. But this is where I get stuck. It's like, I have had 0 success trying to pull out individual items to do it and have it work. And it's like, oh cool, we could do single item exports. But it's never worked for me. So are these tools helping you with that? Like, setting these tools aside, what have you found when you're actually using CMI and using the exports? Have you personally had any success being able to pick out single item exports and have it work?
I actually never use the UI, so I do it all with Drush, and generally I haven't done individual items. So
I can give an example. I mean, I have done both. Features, if one of the, you could use features to do a similar, I want to find dependencies of these things and pick it from the UI. So like, I want this content type, and it will attempt to find all the relevant configuration files and export them. And you can use it to solely, I want to import this folder of configuration files in a very explicit, like, kind of like a Drush import this one folder, right? So you can do what you're saying, and features might help you if you just want to focus on that individual piece. When you're combining it with something like config split, though, they're kind of different approaches, where config split is like, everything is in the one folder, and then you have selected overrides, which you're selecting either through this interface or your hand, basically figuring out, okay, I know that a field has a field storage and a field implementation for each content type and all these other things, and then I'm going to simulate a deployment, and when it doesn't work, I have to go and figure out which things were missing. So it's not, features is not perfect with dependencies, but if you're interested in that one, it might be worth looking at. Although it seems like people are moving, the people that I'm working with are moving more towards the fixed one.
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed away from features just because with my experience, I mean, features seem like a great idea with D7, like, oh, and I'm going to map it out, I'm going to get all this, but features just seem like a nightmare solution to a hellish problem. And like dealing with field bases and all, like, I'm going to set this up and it's going to be totally going to work. And we always ended up in a situation like, oh, but wait, we kind of got ourselves into the circular loop, and that's reverted and that's overridden. It's like, oh my God, I thought I had this, like before we did anything, I laid all of it out, and features was going to work perfectly for us, and then it didn't, and it sucked, and it was a headache. And so I haven't gone back to features, like, I'm not doing features again. I'm not going down this road. And so I was like, but cool, because now we've got configuration, we've got YAML files, and this is all going to be awesome. And then I run into this situation like,
so what you could do, like, if you use features to create a feature, you can just copy all those files into a completely split folder, and then it did your dependency. It tried to do the dependency part for you, and you don't have to use features. Like, all that makes it a feature is the one file that gives it a name. And if you delete that, it just becomes a module at that point, and it doesn't do anything. So I've had pretty good success in moving configuration files between random features into the config default directory. Like, Drupal doesn't really care where the files are because it's these helper tools that I'm using. Sorry if I'm not.
No, that's it. So it's really good. As you can see, there are lots of different use cases, lots of different solutions out there, different approaches as we're developing and learning, running into problems.
config management is hard. I mean, that's part of
Yeah,
it's a hard thing to do.
I don't think anybody has that answer at this point. It seems like with the gray list and with the input split options, I mean, this is also like you might have said this at the beginning, sorry, was it? With this workflow specifically for like three environments, right? Dev, stage, prod.
Yeah.
If you only have one site, like maybe you don't need that, right? If you don't need the dev stage prod, if you have a platform of sites that all have the same code base, like you were kind of alluding to, like you have a whole other set of problems.
Yeah.
And there's configuration files, like the SEO meta tag stuff that might be specific for a site on the platform, and you don't want to export that ever, or like the site name. So there's a lot of other things that make the gray list looks more and more appealing because you know that that stuff's needed to be configured by a content administrator.
Yeah. And this, I think, is not just Drupal specific problem.
Right.
Thinking about what is configuration, how do I want to handle it, how do I want to share it, how do I want to move between environments. Then you throw in a mix where, oh, I want to share this between different sites, and it gets complicated, it gets messy. So, any other questions, thoughts?
You didn't let us stop.
Okay, great. One final, I have a lot of references, resources. I've uploaded these slides to the session information on the website, so you can get it all there. As well as if you could give feedback, that would be great. So, thank you.